Adanna's world was once wrapped in golden warmth, a life that seemed untouchable by sorrow. Her father, Chief Nambdi, was a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and village councils alike. He had risen from nothing, carving an empire of companies that stretched across Lagos, Enugu, and Port Harcourt, businesses in food distribution, real estate, and importation. Yet, despite his vast wealth, he was known as a man of integrity, one who bowed his head in prayer each dawn before stepping into the day's battles. His presence filled every space he entered, tall, broad-shouldered, his laughter deep and reassuring, his words measured but firm. At home, he transformed from magnate to mentor, never allowing money to create distance between him and his only daughter. He would sit with Adanna every evening on their wide balcony, the city lights twinkling like scattered stars, telling her stories of resilience and sacrifice, of men who built empires through sweat, and of women who carried wisdom like crowns. Adanna would lean against him, her big brown eyes wide with curiosity, clutching her notebook where she scribbled dreams of becoming a leader like her parents. "Remember this, my Ada," he often said, his voice gentle but resolute. "Wealth means nothing if it cannot give others life. If all you own dies with you, then you have lived for nothing." Those words, though she did not know it yet, would one day anchor her in storms she could never have imagined. Her mother, Oluchi, was no less remarkable. Where her father built companies with iron discipline, her mother wove empires of beauty and creativity. She was a celebrated fashion designer, her outlets stretching across Lagos Island, Abuja, and even Accra. Her hands stitched not just fabric, but identity. Her designs blended African tradition with modern elegance, creating gowns that turned heads in every gathering. Women of influence wore her clothes proudly, whispering her name with admiration, while apprentices in her shop spoke of her kindness as much as her genius. At home, Oluchi's love was the glue that bound the family. She filled the mansion with warmth, the smell of jollof rice simmering in the kitchen, the sound of gospel music humming through the halls on Saturday mornings, the sight of colorful wrappers spread across the dining table as she prepared new sketches. Adanna was her shadow, often sitting by her side as she worked, doodling designs of her own, dreaming that one day she too might create something beautiful. Her mother often looked at her and smiled, brushing her cheek with the back of her hand. "Ada, you will not just wear crowns," she said. "You will design them, shape them, and carry them with grace." Those words made Adanna believe she was destined for something greater than herself, something eternal. Life in the Nambdi household was a portrait of harmony and prosperity. Their mansion in Victoria Garden City was the kind that made neighbors whisper, not for its arrogance but for the joy that seemed to spill out of it. The marble floors glistened under the chandelier light, wide staircases curled gracefully upward, and the walls were adorned with framed photos of family trips abroad and traditional festivals back home. Yet for all the grandeur, the family lived with humility. Sundays were sacred. They went to church in matching attires, returned to feast together, and then spent the afternoons sharing stories or playing games. Evenings often ended with laughter echoing through the compound, neighbors passing by and saying, "That house is blessed." Adanna, at 14, was the jewel of the home. Bright, lively, and full of questions, she was her father's pride and her mother's joy. She excelled in school, particularly in literature and debates, and dreamed of one day becoming a voice for the voiceless. She had friends who admired her, teachers who praised her, and a future paved with promise. If ever there was a child born to walk in destiny, it was Adanna. And yet, beyond the walls of this happiness, shadows were gathering. Her uncles, blood relatives who should have been her guardians, watched from the sidelines with hearts poisoned by envy. Each success of Nambdi, each expansion of Oluchi, each smile on Adanna's face fed a fire of greed that burned silently but fiercely. They masked it with smiles during family gatherings, offering hollow praises, but their eyes betrayed their true intent. It was on a humid evening, as the sun melted into a fiery horizon and the air smelled of rain, that the first crack in Adanna's golden world appeared. Her father had returned from a business trip, weary but happy, hugging his daughter tightly as she ran into his arms. They ate dinner together, laughing as her mother teased Nambdi about his growing waistline. The night seemed ordinary, like so many before it, yet fate was already sharpening its knife. Later that week, tragedy struck with merciless suddenness. The car crash was swift and unforgiving, a ghastly accident that claimed both her parents in one cruel sweep. The news fell upon Adanna like a hammer shattering glass, her world splintering into pieces she could not gather. One moment she had a family, wealth, and protection. The next, she stood alone in a silence that roared louder than any noise. Neighbors wailed, relatives arrived in black lace, and condolences poured like rain, but nothing could fill the void. As she stood beside the coffins of the two people who had been her light, tears blurring her vision, she felt the first chilling touch of abandonment. In the crowd, her uncles' faces were unreadable, eyes cold, lips pressed thin, as though already calculating the spoils of the empire her parents left behind. Adanna did not yet know it, but the storm had begun. The day of the burial was heavy with grief, but beneath the sorrow laid currents of greed that only few could sense. The compound overflowed with guests, business associates in flowing agbadas, family friends in black lace, neighbors whispering condolences. Gospel choirs sang mournful hymns, and rented trumpeters blew their horns into the humid Lagos air. The house that once rang with laughter now echoed with wails and footsteps. At the center of it all sat Adanna, her small frame swallowed by a black gown, her eyes swollen from tears she could not hold back. She clung to the memory of her parents' voices, the warmth of their hands, the promise of safety that had vanished overnight. Her uncles, men who should have been her pillars, carried themselves with a strange authority. They spoke loudly, gave orders to staff, and positioned themselves as the new guardians of the house. To the outsiders, it looked like they were protecting the orphan, standing strong for family unity. But to those who looked closer, their eyes betrayed something colder, a calculation, a hunger for power, a readiness to erase Adanna's place in the legacy her parents left behind. When the coffins were lowered into the ground, Adanna felt her heart descend with them. In that moment, she thought her life could not be darker. She did not yet know that the grave they had dug was not only for her parents, but for the golden world she once knew. Barely a week later, the pretense ended. Adanna was summoned into the grand living room where she had once listened to her father's stories. The chandeliers still glittered. The polished marble floor still reflected the light, but to her, the house already felt different. Cold, hollow, robbed of the warmth that her parents had carried. Her uncles sat in her father's chairs, their arms crossed, their expressions hard. The oldest, Uncle Chick, spoke first, his voice sharp and unforgiving. "Adanna," he said, his tone slicing through the air, "this house and all that your father left behind no longer belong to you. There was no will. Everything falls under our care now. We will manage the businesses, the properties, everything." Adanna's lips trembled. But I am their daughter," she whispered, clutching her dress tightly. "This is my home," Daddy said enough. Another uncle barked, slamming his palm against the glass table. "Your father left no written will, no proof. And you, a mere child, cannot inherit what men built with sweat. From today you will not live here. You will not eat here. This house is no longer yours." Adanna's eyes widened in disbelief. She turned to the house staff who had once cared for her, pleading silently for someone to defend her, but they lowered their eyes. Loyalty had shifted overnight. The uncles smirked as they watched her crumble, enjoying the weight of their cruelty. In one brutal sentence, her identity was stripped, her inheritance stolen, her safety shattered. The humiliation was swift and merciless. Her belongings were dragged out of her room, tossed carelessly into the compound as if they were scraps. Clothes were scattered, books thrown into the dust, her mother's sketches torn and trampled under careless feet. Adanna fell to her knees, scrambling to gather what little she could, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "This is all I have left of them." But her cries were drowned out by the laughter of her uncle's wives, who stood watching from the balcony, their eyes cold with disdain. Neighbors gathered outside the gate, whispering, shaking their heads, pity written on their faces, but fear keeping them silent. Some muttered, "How can blood do this to blood?" while others warned, "Do not interfere. Power is a dangerous thing." When Adanna tried to resist, when she clung to the iron gates and refused to move, one of the guards pried her fingers loose and shoved her into the dust. The heavy gates clanged shut with finality, locking her out of the only home she had ever known. She stood barefoot in the street, clutching a torn school bag to her chest, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. It was as if the city itself had turned its back on her, swallowing her cries in the noise of passing cars. For the first time, she realized she was utterly alone. The days that followed broke her spirit in ways she never thought possible. She went from house to house, knocking on relatives' doors, hoping for mercy. But greed had already poisoned them all. Some claimed they had no space. Others muttered excuses about school fees and too many mouths to feed. A few shut their doors outright, unwilling to cross her powerful uncles. Each rejection cut deeper, a knife twisting in the wounds of her heart. Adanna walked the streets at night, dragging her small bundle of clothes, her stomach growling with hunger, her eyes swollen from endless tears. She slept in abandoned shops, curled against cold concrete floors, using her thin clothes as blankets, whispering her parents' names into the darkness. Sometimes she went 2 days without food, her lips dry, her body weak, yet her spirit clung stubbornly to life. Strangers in the market eyed her with suspicion, some offering her scraps, others chasing her away like a stray. And yet, even in her lowest moments, she whispered to herself, "I will not give up. I will not die like this." Those words, fragile and trembling, became her shield. The world had cast her aside, but deep within, a seed of resilience had begun to take root. She did not know it yet, but the storm that had swept her away was also shaping her into something unbreakable. The first night Adanna spent on the streets was an initiation into a new world of suffering. The abandoned shop she stumbled into was nothing like the mansion she had once called home. Its cracked walls oozed dampness. The ceiling leaked when rain began to fall, and the air smelled of dust, rust, and urine from passersby who had once used it as shelter. She curled herself into the corner, hugging her thin bag tightly. Every sound outside, the barking dogs, the shouting of drunken men, the rumbling of Danfo buses, felt like a threat. Sleep refused to come. She thought of her father's voice telling her bedtime stories, her mother's laughter echoing through their living room, the safety of her warm bed, and for the first time, the memories felt like mockery. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, sharp and merciless, twisting until tears welled in her eyes. She whispered their names into the dark, "Papa," "Mama, where are you?" But only the wind answered. By morning, her eyes were swollen, her lips dry, her dress stiff with dust. She walked the streets aimlessly, watching children her age in neat uniforms rushing to school with their mothers, while she wandered like a shadow, invisible, forgotten. At 14, Adanna had been stripped of everything but her name, and even that felt like it no longer belonged to her. Her survival became a patchwork of humiliations stitched together by sheer will. She washed clothes for strangers, bending over buckets until her fingers bled, earning just enough to buy stale bread. Some days she offered to clean houses, scrubbing floors while women sneered at her, saying, "So this is Chief Nambdi's daughter? Look at her now." Other days she carried loads in the market, straining under sacks twice her weight, her back aching, her shoulders blistered. At bus stops she hawked sachet water, running between cars under the scorching Lagos sun, dodging insults and swats from impatient drivers. She endured it all because hunger was a teacher more ruthless than any school. Nights were worse. The streets were not kind to a young girl. Drunken men leered at her, area boys mocked her, and sometimes she had to run, her heart pounding, clutching her little bag as if it held her soul. On nights when she found no abandoned stall to sleep in, she curled under shop verandas, shielding herself from the cold with nothing but her thin arms. Yet, in every dawn, no matter how broken she felt, she forced herself to rise. Her voice quivered when she whispered, "I will not give up," and somehow, those words gave her the strength to keep going when her body screamed to collapse. Hunger remained her most relentless enemy. There were days she ate nothing but crumbs, begging for leftover bread from roadside sellers. Once, after going nearly 2 days without food, she sat by a refused dump, watching flies swarm around half-eaten morsels of rice. Shame and hunger fought inside her until she gave in, picking the food carefully, brushing off dirt, and eating slowly as tears streamed down her face. She remembered the feasts her family once had on Sundays, tables filled with steaming jollof, fried plantain, goat meat pepper soup, and laughter bouncing off the walls. Now, every bite of rotten food felt like betrayal, yet it was survival. When sickness came, it nearly broke her. Fever left her shivering at night, her throat raw from thirst, but she had no medicine. She dragged herself to the market anyway, working until her knees buckled, because to rest was to starve. Once, she fainted while sweeping a shop, and when she woke, the owner shoved her out, muttering, "Don't come here to die." Her eyes burned with humiliation, but she still rose to her feet. It was during one of these desperate days that she earned her first 100 washing a woman's clothes. She bought a piece of bread with it and held it in her hands, staring at it like treasure before taking a bite. She ate slowly, deliberately, savoring each mouthful, but she saved half. That evening, as she curled up in her shop corner, she whispered to the stars, "If I can survive this, I can survive anything." Weeks bled into months, and Adanna's body changed under the weight of her struggles. Her once smooth skin grew dark and rough from the sun, her palms hardened from endless labor, her voice hoarse from calling out in markets and bus stops. Yet inside, a strange strength was forming. She learned to endure insults without responding, to stretch a single naira as far as it could go, to find odd corners of the city where she could rest unseen. Each failure taught her something new: how to bargain, how to avoid thieves, how to recognize genuine kindness from deceitful pity. And through it all, her determination refused to die. She began to dream again, not of palaces or riches, but of simple survival, of building something small that no one could take from her. One day, she whispered to herself as she wiped sweat from her brow, "I will stand again. One day, they will see me." Though the city did not care, though the world mocked her, Adanna's spirit hardened like steel and fire. She was no longer just the orphan they had thrown out, she was becoming a survivor. And as the nights grew longer and the days harsher, one truth burned within her: the storm had not destroyed her. It was shaping her into the woman destiny required her to be. The change began so quietly it was almost invisible, like the slow breaking of dawn after a long night. By now, Adanna had endured more than a year of scraping through the streets, working odd jobs that barely kept her alive. Yet she had learned to stretch every kobo, to hide small coins in the lining of her bag, and to resist the temptation of spending all she earned at once. One humid morning, after saving little by little, she unfolded the crumpled note she had guarded like treasure. 500 naira. It was not much, but to Adanna it was the beginning of a new life. Instead of spending it on food as her hungry body begged her to, she made a different choice. She walked into the bustling market and bought a small tray of groundnuts, carrying them carefully on her head as she stepped into the chaos of Lagos streets. At first, she stumbled, her voice trembling as she called out to passersby, "Groundnut, sweet groundnut, come and buy." People ignored her. Some mocked her, but she kept shouting until the first customer stopped, bought a handful, and handed her a few coins. That evening, when she counted her small profit, her heart swelled with a new kind of joy. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt she had taken control of something, no matter how small. She ate that night with dignity, not from pity or scraps, but from the work of her own hands. It was a victory so fragile it could be broken by the morning, but to Adanna, it was proof that she was not powerless. From that day on, she carried herself differently. She woke earlier than the sun, washed her face with cold water from street taps, and hurried to the market to buy goods for resale. Some days it was groundnuts, other days oranges, puff, or sachet water. The profit was never large, but Adanna learned the art of reinvestment. She denied herself luxuries like meat or new clothes, choosing instead to grow her little trade. When her stomach groaned with hunger, she reminded herself that every coin she saved was a seed. It was not an easy path. Older hawkers mocked her, market women tried to cheat her, and rain often ruined her goods. But Adanna endured, her determination sharper than hunger. Slowly, the profits began to add up. After months of sacrifice, she saved enough to buy a bigger tray and stock more goods. That small leap changed everything. Now, instead of earning just enough for one meal, she began to make a little extra. With trembling pride, she bought her first exercise book and pen, determined to return to school even if it meant studying by candlelight after long days of hawking. She enrolled herself in a local public school, sitting among children who sometimes teased her for being older, but she refused to bow her head. Each morning she hawked before classes, and each evening she hawked again after dismissal. Her body often ached, her eyes burned with fatigue, but her spirit soared with a new conviction. The orphan had found a way to rise. The sacrifices were endless, yet they bound her to her dreams even more tightly. There were days she wanted to collapse, days when her earnings vanished because rain scattered her goods or bullies stole from her. But Adanna refused to stop. At night, in the one-room shack she now rented with her own money, she spread her books on the floor and read under the flicker of a kerosene lamp. whispering her parents' names as if they were beside her. Sometimes she fell asleep over her books, her head resting on the pages, her body sore from the day's hustle. Other times she starved herself so she could save money to buy more stock. Yet in every sacrifice, she saw purpose. One day, she told herself, these pains will turn into strength. These scars will open doors. She made friends in school who admired her determination, teachers who noticed her brilliance despite her ragged uniforms, and customers in the market who began to trust her honesty. Her name, once spoken in pity, was now whispered in admiration. That girl is different. She is going somewhere. And Adanna believed it too. Every naira she saved, every grade she earned, every day she survived without giving up was a brick in the foundation of the life she was building. Years passed, and the girl who once picked food from refused bins was no longer the same. Adanna grew into a young woman whose resilience inspired everyone who crossed her path. Her food business expanded, first from a tray to a small stall, then from a stall to a rented shop. Customers flocked to her not just for her goods, but for the dignity with which she treated them. She was disciplined with her profits, reinvesting tirelessly, refusing to live recklessly. At the same time, her education blossomed. She rose to the top of her class, winning scholarships and awards that pushed her further than she had ever imagined. Teachers often said, "This girl will change her generation." And truly, she was already changing herself. Each morning when she opened her shop, arranging her goods neatly, she remembered the nights she had cried in abandoned shops, the days she had been shoved into the dust. Those memories fueled her. She knew she could never erase the scars of betrayal, but she could transform them into strength. Sitting in her shop one evening, counting her profits, she whispered with tears in her eyes, "Mama, Papa, your Ada is rising. Slowly but surely, I am rising." It was the truth. The storm had tried to bury her, but she had turned her pain into seeds, and they were beginning to bloom. By the time Adanna turned 25, the girl who once hawked sachet water barefoot on the streets had become a name that resonated across Lagos markets. What began as a tray of groundnuts had grown into a chain of thriving food businesses. Her discipline, honesty, and relentless work ethic turned customers into loyal followers. And soon her brand, Adanna Foods, was stamped boldly across shops and delivery trucks that supplied rice, beans, palm oil, and flour to neighborhoods far and wide. She became known as the woman who never cheated her customers, who reinvested every naira, and who treated even her lowest staff with dignity. By 30, she had expanded into wholesale and established her own distribution network, employing hundreds of young men and women, many of them girls like her who had once been abandoned or mistreated. For them, she became more than a boss. She was a mentor, a lifeline. She set up scholarships for girls in poor neighborhoods, funded skill training programs, and spoke at schools about resilience. Her story was carried in newspapers, told in churches, and whispered in awe. That girl, good the orphan day throughout, see what she has become. Yet, through all the applause and wealth, Adanna lived simply. She owned a modest but warm home in Lekki, decorated not with gold but with framed photographs of her parents and the smiling faces of the young women she had empowered. Every night, as she closed her books and planned the next day's business, she whispered, "Papa, Mama, I hope you see me." Your Ada did not fail. While Adanna's light grew brighter, the darkness around her uncles thickened. For years, they lived lavishly off the wealth they had stolen, parading as kings of the estate that was never theirs. They threw parties that spilled into the streets, hosted politicians, and spoiled their children with luxuries. But greed is a poison that eats from within, and slowly, their empire began to crumble. Businesses that once flourished under Chief Nambdi's careful hand collapsed under their reckless spending. They took loans they could not repay, sold lands for quick cash, and fought bitterly among themselves over what remained. Their children, raised without discipline or values, squandered money on gambling, drugs, and reckless living. One by one, the companies went bankrupt, the houses were seized by banks, and the cars were sold off to pay debts. Sickness entered their homes like a curse, strokes, diabetes, mysterious illnesses that drained their strength. Neighbors whispered that the ghosts of Nambdi and Oluchi had risen to defend their daughter, punishing the men who betrayed her. The once proud uncles who strutted in agbadas now wore faded clothes, their bellies gone, their voices subdued. They who once locked a little girl out of her own home were now locked out of boardrooms, ignored by former allies, abandoned by friends. It was as if fate itself had turned its back on them. The first time Adanna crossed paths with them again was not by chance, it was destiny. She had been invited to deliver a keynote speech at a women's empowerment summit in Lagos. The hall was filled with dignitaries, entrepreneurs, and students eager to hear her story. She stood tall on stage, her voice steady, her presence commanding as she spoke about resilience, sacrifice, and the power of never giving up. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled notes, and applause thundered through the hall. At the back, two of her uncles sat quietly, almost unrecognizable. Their clothes were wrinkled, their faces hollowed by age and sickness. They had come not as proud guardians, but as broken men seeking something they could not yet name. When Adanna's eyes swept the hall and landed on them, her heart clenched. Memories of the night they shoved her into the dust flooded back. The humiliation, the hunger, the tears. For a moment, her voice wavered, but she steadied herself. She finished her speech with words that cut like a blade cloaked in honey. Never let betrayal define you. Let it refine you. For those who rise from the ashes, even fire becomes powerless. The hall erupted in applause, but her uncles could not lift their heads. They knew the words were meant for them. From that day, their paths began to intertwine again. The uncles, now desperate, tried to reach out to her in private, their voices trembling as they begged for help. They spoke of debts, of sickness, of children who had abandoned them. But Adanna did not rush to embrace them. She listened quietly, her face unreadable, her heart torn between anger and pity. She did not spit venom, nor did she offer instant mercy. Instead, she allowed time and truth to do what she alone could not. And truth came, sharp and undeniable, when documents long hidden by lies finally surfaced. Her father's real will, preserved by an old lawyer burdened with guilt. The papers revealed that Chief Nambdi had left everything to his wife and daughter, entrusting his brothers only with temporary oversight should anything happen. It was a revelation that shook the city. The courts convened. The truth was laid bare, and the uncles were disgraced in public view. Their deception, their theft, their cruelty, all exposed. Adanna did not dance on their downfall, but she did not shield them either. Justice had come, not with swords, but with truth. And as she stood outside the courthouse, reporters shoving microphones before her, as she spoke with quiet strength, "This is not only about me. It is about every child betrayed by those who should have protected them. Let it be known, greed destroys, but resilience builds. My parents' legacy did not die, it lives through me, and through every girl who refuses to give up." Her words spread like wildfire, a beacon of hope for the broken and a warning to the greedy. The courthouse was packed that morning, the air heavy with anticipation. Journalists lined the entrance, their cameras flashing, while curious onlookers craned their necks for a glimpse of the woman whose story had become a legend. Adanna arrived with quiet dignity, dressed not in flashy designer clothes, but in a simple yet elegant gown from her mother's old collection, her head held high, her presence commanding respect without a single word. She walked past the reporters who shouted questions, past the relatives who whispered her name in awe, and entered the courtroom where her uncle sat, shrunken shadows of the men who once ruled her life with cruelty. Their agbadas, once symbols of pride, now looked oversized on their frail frames. Their faces were lined with guilt and exhaustion. When her eyes met theirs, they shifted uncomfortably, unable to hold her gaze. For Adanna, the moment was not about revenge, it was about truth. She had carried the weight of their betrayal for years, and now the world would see it for what it was. The proceedings began with her lawyers presenting the long-hidden will, the words of her late father written in firm, unmistakable ink. "To my beloved daughter, Adanna, and my wife Oluchi, I leave all that I've built, not only wealth but the duty to use it well." Gasps filled the room. The judge's gavel struck like thunder, silencing the murmurs, and the truth echoed through every corner. Adanna had always been the rightful heir. Her uncles attempted to defend themselves, their voices trembling, weaving tales of confusion, claiming they had only acted to protect the family's wealth. But their words fell flat. Witnesses came forward, former staff who admitted they had been threatened into silence, family friends who recalled Chief Nambdi speaking proudly of his plans for his daughter's future. Even the lawyer who once conspired with them broke down on the stand, confessing that guilt had haunted him for years until he could no longer carry the burden. Piece by piece, their lies unraveled, and the image they had built of themselves as guardians crumbled to dust. The judge, stern and unyielding, declared their actions fraudulent, their claims void, their names stained with disgrace. Adanna sat still through it all, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm but her heart pounding. She was not rejoicing in their downfall. She was simply bearing witness to justice. When the verdict was finally pronounced, that her inheritance be restored, that her parents' companies and properties be returned to her name, the courtroom erupted in noise. Some cheered, others gasped, reporters rushed to file their stories. But Adanna remained seated, tears welling in her eyes, whispering silently, "Mama, Papa, it is done." Outside the courthouse, the world met her with thunderous applause. Reporters pressed forward, microphones thrust toward her, voices clamoring, "Adanna, how do you feel now that justice has been served?" She stood on the courthouse steps, the sun casting a glow around her, and spoke with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the storm. "This is not just about me," she began, her voice steady, resonating with conviction. "It is about every child cast aside, every orphan cheated, every voice silenced by greed. I was thrown into the streets with nothing, yet here I stand, not because I am stronger than anyone else, but because I refuse to give up. Let my story remind you, no matter how dark life gets, resilience can rewrite destiny. Greed destroys, but love and determination endure." Her words spread like wildfire across newspapers, radio, television, and social media. People who had never met her felt as though they knew her. Young girls painted her name on their walls, mothers told her story to their children, and in markets across the city, hawkers whispered with pride, "Adanna started like us. If she can rise, so can we." In that moment, she was no longer just a survivor, she had become a symbol. Her uncles, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. The same men who once stood tall in their stolen wealth now lived in loneliness, abandoned by their own children, haunted by regret. Some whispered that their sicknesses grew worse after the trial, that their homes were filled not with laughter but with the heavy silence of shame. But Adanna did not linger on them. She forgave them in her heart, not because they deserved it, but because she refused to let bitterness chain her to the past. She channeled her victory into building a future worthy of her parents' legacy. She expanded her businesses nationwide, employing thousands, and created a foundation in her parents' names to sponsor education for orphans and empower widows. Schools, hospitals, and housing projects sprang up under her guidance, each one a testament to her resilience. And through it all, she remained grounded, always remembering the girl who once whispered to herself in the dark, "I will not give up." That whisper had become a roar that echoed across the nation. The moral of this story is that resilience, determination, and integrity can turn even the darkest suffering into a triumphant destiny.